Marcus Webb had never been the kind of man who walked into rooms and turned heads. He was 34 years old, worked as a music teacher at a public school in a mid-sized city, and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that made a strange sound whenever he turned left. He owned 2 suits, both of which he had bought on clearance, and he kept his shoes polished because his mother had told him that a man's character shows up in his shoes before his words do. He was not poor exactly, but he existed in that particular kind of quiet struggle where you are always one unexpected bill away from a bad month. So when his college friend Daniel called him out of nowhere on a Thursday evening and told him there was an invitation to a private party at the Hargrove estate, Marcus almost said no. Richard Hargrove was the kind of name that appeared in financial magazines and occasionally on the news when someone was discussing the economy. He had built a technology company in his late 20s, sold it for an amount that required several commas to write properly, and had since turned himself into one of those figures who collected influence the way other people collected stamps. His home was not really a home, it was a statement. Daniel had connections that Marcus never fully understood. They had met in college during a music theory class, bonded over a shared hatred of a particular professor, and somehow stayed friends across 15 years and very different life paths. Daniel worked in finance now, traveled frequently, wore watches that cost more than Marcus made in a month. And yet he still called Marcus on his birthday and remembered that Marcus took his coffee black. He had gotten the invitation through a business associate and was allowed to bring one guest, and for reasons Marcus would think about later, he chose Marcus. Marcus almost wore his better suit, which was charcoal gray and still held its shape reasonably well. But Daniel texted him the day before the party and gently mentioned that the event was formal, which was a word that caused Marcus to stand in front of his closet for a long time. He ended up renting a tuxedo, which cost him more than he wanted to admit, and he spent the evening of the party standing in his bathroom trying to get the bow tie right, watching 3 different videos on his phone before he finally managed something that looked intentional. The Hargrove estate was 40 minutes outside the city, and as Daniel's car moved down the long private road lined with lights on either side, Marcus sat quietly in the passenger seat and looked out the window. The house came into view slowly, the way large things often do, revealing itself in sections until the whole picture was there. It was the kind of building that made you feel your own smallness without meaning to. There were cars parked along a curved stone driveway that probably cost more collectively than the school where Marcus worked. People were moving through the entrance in clothes that fit them perfectly, the kind of fit that comes from tailoring rather than luck. Daniel moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who had been in rooms like this before. He introduced Marcus to people whose names Marcus immediately forgot, not because he was careless, but because the introductions came too fast and each person seemed to carry a title or an affiliation that required a moment to process. Marcus shook hands and smiled and said the right things, but he was aware the whole time of a particular feeling that he could not quite name. It was not embarrassment exactly. It was something closer to the sensation of wearing shoes that almost fit. The main room was enormous and filled with the low hum of conversation mixed with the sound of a string quartet playing in one corner. There was a bar along one wall, a series of high tables with food arranged on them in ways that seemed to prioritize appearance over portion size, and clusters of people standing in configurations that all seemed to suggest a history Marcus was not part of. He got a drink, something the bartender described with several words, and stood near Daniel as Daniel fell into conversation with a man in a navy jacket who apparently ran a shipping company. That was when Marcus noticed the piano. It was a grand piano, positioned near the back of the room, slightly away from the main crowd. The kind of instrument that existed in places like this as furniture as much as a musical instrument. It was a Steinway, black and polished to a shine that caught the light from the chandeliers above. It had the lid propped open, which meant someone had played it recently, or at least someone intended it to be played. Marcus stood there with his drink and looked at it for a moment the way you look at something that belongs to a different world than yours, but still feels strangely familiar. A woman nearby noticed him looking at it and made a comment to the man beside her, something said low but not low enough. She said something to the effect that the piano was purely decorative and that Richard had bought it because it completed the room, not because anyone here actually played. The man beside her laughed in that short, dismissive way that people laugh when they are agreeing without thinking. A third person joined them briefly, glanced in Marcus's direction, took in his rented tuxedo and his slightly uncertain posture, and made some remark about the guest list getting broader every year. Marcus heard it. He was not meant to hear it, or perhaps he was, which is a cruelty that certain people deploy while maintaining plausible deniability. He took a slow sip of his drink and said nothing. He looked back at the piano. He had been playing since he was 6 years old, had studied formally through college. had spent his entire adult life teaching other people how to find something real inside a collection of notes. He stood there in his rented tuxedo in a room full of people who had already decided what he was, and he looked at that piano, and he thought quietly to himself that sometimes a room tells you exactly what it needs. Part 2 began the way most significant moments do, not with a dramatic announcement but with a small and almost accidental decision. Marcus finished what was left in his glass, set it down carefully on a nearby table, and simply started walking toward the piano. He did not announce himself. He did not ask anyone for permission. He moved through the edge of the crowd with the quiet purposefulness of someone who had somewhere to be, and most people did not notice him at all, which was something he had grown used to over the years. Daniel was still deep in conversation on the other side of the room and had not seen Marcus move. The woman who had made the comment about the guest list had turned her back and was laughing at something someone else had said. The string quartet in the corner had paused between pieces, and in that brief gap the ambient noise of the room filled in, conversations layering over each other, glasses touching, shoes moving across the polished floor. Marcus reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, resting one hand lightly on its edge. Up close, the instrument was even more impressive than it had looked from across the room. It was a Steinway Model D, the kind used in concert halls, and whoever maintained it kept it in exceptional condition. The keys were white and even and waiting. Marcus pulled out the bench, which slid soundlessly across the floor, and sat down. He adjusted his position slightly, the way he always did out of habit, settling into the particular posture that his first piano teacher had drilled into him when he was 7 years old. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, wrists level. It was muscle memory at this point, as automatic as breathing. He placed his hands on the keys without playing yet and just felt the cool of the ivory beneath his fingers. There was always a moment like this before he played, a kind of interior settling, and it did not matter whether he was sitting at the upright in his classroom or apparently at a Steinway Grand in the home of one of the wealthiest men in the state. The moment was the same. It was the moment where everything outside the instrument became slightly less real. A few people nearby noticed him sitting down and exchanged glances. One couple shifted their position slightly, not leaving but adjusting, the way people do when they are not sure whether something is about to be worth watching or worth avoiding. A man in his 50s with silver hair and a very straight posture looked over with an expression that suggested mild skepticism. Nobody said anything to Marcus. Nobody asked him what he was doing or told him to stop. They simply watched and waited with the specific impatience of people who had already formed an opinion. Marcus started with something unexpected. He did not begin with a showpiece or a technical display. He opened with a piece by Eric Satie, the first Gymnopédie, which is one of those compositions that sounds simple until you understand what it is actually doing. It moves slowly, with long spaces between the notes, and it asks the player to do something that is surprisingly difficult, which is to let those spaces exist without filling them. It requires a kind of confidence that has nothing to do with speed or complexity. It requires the player to trust the silence as much as the sound. The effect on the room was not immediate. The first few bars passed and most people continued their conversations. But something was shifting in the atmosphere, the way temperature shifts before weather changes, subtle enough that you might not notice it consciously but present enough that your body registers it. The couple who had adjusted their position stopped moving. The man with silver hair stopped looking skeptical and started looking attentive. A woman near the bar paused mid-sentence and turned her head. By the time Marcus reached the middle section of the piece, a quiet had begun spreading through the room in the way that quiet sometimes does in the presence of something genuine. It did not happen all at once. It moved outward from the piano in a slow radius, one conversation ending, then another, then a small group near the window turning together without any of them having said a word to prompt it. The string quartet, who had been preparing to start their next piece, set down their bows and listened. The bartender stopped what he was doing. Daniel heard the change in the room before he identified the source of it. He was mid-sentence with the man in the navy jacket when he became aware that something had altered in the background, a quality of attention shifting in the crowd, and he looked up and turned and saw Marcus at the piano. He did not say anything. He just stopped talking and watched, and the man in the navy jacket followed his gaze and stopped talking too. Marcus finished the Satie piece and let the final note decay completely before lifting his hands from the keys. The room was quiet in a way it had not been since the party began. It was not the polished, performative quiet of people pretending to listen. It was the genuine kind, the kind that comes when people have been pulled briefly out of themselves and are not quite ready to return. It lasted only a few seconds before someone began to applaud, and then the applause spread quickly, fuller and more genuine than the kind that gets offered out of social obligation. Marcus did not stand or bow or look around the room with any expression of triumph. He sat at the piano and he moved directly into the next piece, a Chopin nocturne, because he was not finished and because the room had asked him a question and he intended to answer it completely. He had spent 30 years learning how to do this one thing with his whole self, in rented rooms and underfunded classrooms and church halls with bad acoustics, and he had never needed an audience's approval to know that what he did was real. But as his hands moved across the keys and the music filled that enormous, expensive room, there was something that felt like balance being restored, quietly and without ceremony, in the way that true things often are. Part 3 unfolded in the way that unexpected moments sometimes do, not by continuing to build but by revealing what had been there all along. When Marcus finished the Chopin Nocturne, the applause was longer this time and came from more people and carried a different quality than before. It was not the polite kind that gets offered to fill silence. It had weight to it. People were clapping because something had happened to them while they were listening, and they were responding to that experience honestly, which is not always easy for people in rooms like that one. Marcus finally turned on the bench and looked at the room. It was the first time since sitting down that he had allowed himself to fully take in the crowd, and what he saw surprised him slightly. The faces looking back at him were not wearing the expressions he might have expected based on how the evening had begun. There was no condescension left in the room, at least not that he could see from where he sat. What he saw instead was something much simpler and much more human, which was genuine interest. People were looking at him the way people look at someone they want to understand better. The woman who had made the comment about the guest list was standing near the edge of the gathered crowd. Marcus noticed her because she was one of the few people not applauding. She was not being hostile. She simply looked like someone who had been caught off guard and had not yet decided how to reorganize herself around that fact. Her expression was not cruel anymore. It was something more complicated than that, something that sat between embarrassment and recalibration, and Marcus held no particular feeling toward her in that moment. He had not played to prove anything to her specifically. He had played because the piano was there and the room needed it, and he was the person who knew how. Richard Hargrove appeared from somewhere in the crowd and walked toward the piano with the unhurried movement of a man who was accustomed to being the most significant presence in any room, but who, in this particular moment, did not seem interested in being that. He was shorter than Marcus had imagined, somewhere in his early 60s, with the kind of tan that comes from actual outdoor time rather than a booth. He was dressed simply for someone of his wealth, a dark suit without a tie, and his expression as he approached was open and without the guardedness that very powerful people often carry in public. He extended his hand when he reached Marcus, and Marcus stood and shook it. Richard said that he had not expected to hear playing like that tonight and that he meant it without qualification. There was nothing performative in the way he said it. He asked Marcus how long he had been playing, and Marcus told him, and Richard nodded in the way people nod when an answer confirms something they had already sensed. He asked Marcus what he did, and Marcus told him he taught music at a public school, and Richard looked at him for a moment without saying anything, which was the kind of silence that is actually a form of respect. Daniel had made his way through the crowd by this point and arrived at Marcus's side with an expression that managed to be both proud and slightly stunned. He put a hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. Around them, people were beginning to drift closer. Not in a rushing or overwhelming way, but in the gradual manner of a crowd that has reorganized itself around a new point of interest. Several people introduced themselves to Marcus directly, offering their names and a genuine word or two before moving on, and the interactions had a different texture than the ones from earlier in the evening. Earlier, Marcus had been someone Daniel had brought. Now he was someone people wanted to have met. A younger woman, perhaps in her late 20s, introduced herself as a journalist who covered arts and culture for a national publication. She asked Marcus if she could speak with him briefly, and he said of course. And she asked him several questions that were thoughtful and specific, the kind that come from someone who actually understands the subject rather than someone filling column space. She asked him about teaching, about what it was like to spend a career working with young people in music, about whether he felt that music education received the attention it deserved. Marcus answered her honestly and without performance, and she listened with her whole attention. The man with silver hair who had watched Marcus sit down with skepticism introduced himself as a foundation director whose organization funded arts programs across several states. He asked Marcus detailed questions about the school where he worked and about the resources available to the music program there. Marcus described the situation accurately, which meant describing a program that ran on a budget that required creativity and compromise in equal measure. Instruments that needed repair, a rehearsal space that doubled as a storage room, students who had real talent and limited access to the kind of sustained support that talent requires to develop properly. The foundation director listened without interrupting and asked follow-up questions that suggested he was not just being polite. Richard Hargrove had remained nearby during some of these conversations, not inserting himself but present in the loose and easy way of someone on his own property who is genuinely interested in what is happening. At one point, he caught Marcus's eye across a small gap in the crowd and gave him a small nod, the kind that does not require interpretation. Marcus returned it with the same simplicity. The woman who had commented about the guest list eventually made her way to Marcus as the crowd around him thinned slightly. She introduced herself as Catherine, and she said, without elaborate framing or excessive apology, that she had said something earlier in the evening that she regretted and that she wanted him to know that. Marcus thanked her for saying so and meant it, because an honest acknowledgement offered without theater is something worth receiving gracefully. They spoke for a few minutes after that about nothing in particular, and by the end of it they were simply two people at a party having a conversation, which was all either of them needed to be. The string quartet eventually resumed playing in their corner, and the party flowed back into its natural rhythms. But the quality of the room had changed in a way that did not reverse. Something had been introduced into the evening that altered the atmosphere permanently, the way a single honest moment sometimes can, and Marcus stood in the middle of it holding a fresh drink that someone had brought him without being asked. And he felt, quietly and without making anything of it, completely himself. Arrived not with the energy of the earlier moments but with something steadier and more lasting. The party had moved into its later hours, and the crowd had thinned naturally, the way crowds do when the night has given people enough to carry home. The string quartet had packed away their instruments, the bar had slowed, and the conversations happening now were the longer, quieter kind that emerge when the social performance of an evening has relaxed into something more genuine. Marcus was standing near a window that looked out over the estate's back garden, which was lit softly with ground lights that made the hedges and stone pathways look like something from a painting. Daniel joined him at the window, and they stood together for a moment without speaking, which was the comfortable kind of silence that only exists between people who have known each other long enough to not need to fill every gap. Daniel finally said that he had not expected the evening to go the way it had, and Marcus said he had not either, and they both understood that this was not a complaint. Daniel asked Marcus if he was all right, which was a question that carried more weight than its surface suggested, because Daniel knew Marcus well enough to know that evenings in rooms like this one did not always leave a person feeling good about themselves, regardless of how they ended. Marcus told him he was fine, and he meant it in a way that was complete rather than dismissive. He was fine not because everything had worked out in some tidy and satisfying way, although the evening had certainly turned in a direction he had not anticipated, but because he had done what he always did when the situation called for it. He had played honestly. He had not adjusted his playing for the room or tried to choose pieces he thought would impress the particular kind of people present. He had sat down and played the music that felt true in that moment, and everything that followed had come from that rather than from any strategy or intention. Richard Hargrove found Marcus near the window about 20 minutes later and asked if he had a few minutes to speak somewhere quieter. They moved to a smaller room off the main hall, a study of some kind with bookshelves along two walls and a pair of chairs near a low table. Richard poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher on the table and sat across from Marcus, with the directness of someone who did not enjoy preliminary conversation for its own sake. He told Marcus that he had been thinking since the piano about something he wanted to say, and that he hoped Marcus would receive it in the spirit it was intended. He said that what Marcus had done at the piano was not simply impressive playing, because Richard had heard impressive playing many times and knew the difference between technical excellence and something that actually reached people. What Marcus had done was the second thing, and Richard said that in his experience the second thing was considerably rarer and could not be taught in the way that technique could be taught. It came from somewhere deeper in a person, and it took years of a particular kind of living to develop. The kind of living that involved real work and real commitment without the reward structures that usually accompany genuine talent. Marcus listened without interrupting. He was not used to being spoken to this way, with this particular combination of directness and seriousness, and he found that he did not feel the need to deflect or minimize what Richard was saying, which was his usual instinct when someone offered him a substantial compliment. He let the words settle without pushing them away. Richard then said something that shifted the conversation into different territory. He told Marcus that he had a project he had been considering for some time, something he had not yet found the right person to help him think through, and that the evening had made him wonder if Marcus might be that person. He explained that he had been looking at the state of music education in public schools across the region and that the picture was not encouraging. Programs were being cut or reduced, instruments were aging without replacement budgets, and the teachers who remained were doing remarkable work under conditions that made remarkable work genuinely difficult. He said he had the resources to do something meaningful about this, and had been waiting to find someone who understood the situation from the inside rather than from a distance. Marcus asked Richard what he meant by meaningful, because he had been around long enough to know that the word covered a wide range of actual commitments, from genuine structural change to the kind of well-intentioned gesture that looks good in a press release and changes very little on the ground. Richard appreciated the question, he said so directly, and then he gave a specific answer. He was talking about a foundation initiative, properly funded and properly run, that would work directly with public school music programs to address the specific gaps that teachers identified rather than the gaps that looked most impressive from the outside. He wanted someone who could bridge the distance between what the money could do and what the classrooms actually needed. Someone who understood both the music and the work of teaching it to children who had not been handed every advantage. Marcus was quiet for a moment after Richard finished. He was not performing consideration. He was genuinely thinking, which looked the same from the outside but felt different from the inside. He thought about his classroom, about the students who came in every day and sat down in front of instruments that deserved better and still managed to find something real in the music. He thought about a girl named Priya who had been in his class 3 years ago and who had a natural gift that Marcus had recognized in the first week, and spent the rest of the year trying to nurture with the limited tools available to him. He thought about what a different set of resources might have meant for her and for the students who came after her. He told Richard that he was interested, but that he wanted to be honest about what interested him and what did not. He said he was not interested in a role that existed primarily to lend credibility to something that was ultimately designed around optics rather than outcomes. He said he would want real input into how the resources were directed and real accountability for whether they were making a measurable difference in the actual experience of students and teachers. He said this clearly and without apology, because he had learned over 30 years that the moments when you most need to be direct are exactly the moments when it is most tempting not to be. Richard looked at him for a moment, and then said that was exactly the kind of answer that confirmed he had been right to have the conversation. He said he did not want someone who would simply execute a vision that had been formed without sufficient understanding of the problem. He wanted someone who would push back when pushing back was the correct response, and who would bring the kind of knowledge that only comes from having actually done the work. They talked for another half hour in that small study, and by the time they stood to rejoin the remaining guests, they had not made any formal agreement, but they had established something more important than that, which was a shared understanding of what the work should actually look like and a mutual respect for the seriousness with which the other person approached it. When Marcus walked back through the main hall, the evening had quieted further and the remaining guests were gathered in smaller groups near the bar and along the windows. Daniel was still there, talking with the foundation director Marcus had spoken to earlier, and he looked up when Marcus reappeared and raised his eyebrows in a question. Marcus gave him a small nod that meant something had happened worth talking about later, and Daniel returned a look that said he understood and would wait. The piano was still there in its position near the back of the room, lid still open, catching the light the same way it had all evening. Marcus looked at it once more before finding his jacket, and he felt toward it the particular gratitude you feel towards something that gave you exactly what you needed at exactly the right moment, without asking anything in return. Without asking anything in return. Came quietly, the way most important endings do, not as a conclusion that announced itself, but as a gradual settling into a new shape. The drive back to the city that night was long and dark and comfortable, and Marcus sat in the passenger seat of Daniel's car watching the lights of the estate disappear in the side mirror as they turned onto the main road. Daniel had the radio on low, something instrumental and unhurried, and for the first stretch of the drive neither of them said very much. The silence was not empty. It was full of the particular residue that a significant evening leaves behind, the kind that needs a little time before it can be spoken about properly. Daniel eventually asked Marcus what had happened in the study with Richard, and Marcus told him, laying it out straightforwardly without embellishment. He described what Richard had proposed and how the conversation had gone and what he had said in response, including the part where he had told Richard exactly what kind of involvement he was and was not interested in. Daniel listened without interrupting, which was something Marcus appreciated about him. And when Marcus finished, Daniel was quiet for a moment before saying that he was not surprised, meaning both that he was not surprised Richard had approached Marcus and that he was not surprised Marcus had responded the way he had. Marcus looked out the window at the darkness moving past and thought about the evening from its beginning. He thought about standing in his bathroom wrestling with the bow tie, about pulling up to the estate and feeling the particular smallness that large things can induce, about getting that drink at the bar and drifting to the edges of conversations he had not been designed to enter. He thought about the woman's comment and the laughter and the feeling of being assessed, and found insufficient before anyone had taken the time to find out what he actually was. And then he thought about sitting down at the piano, and how that single decision had not come from a desire to prove anything but from something much simpler, which was that the piano was there and he knew what to do with it, and the room had needed something true. He was not naive about what came next. A conversation in a study, however honest and however promising, was still just a conversation. Richard Hargrove was a busy man with many ideas and many demands on his attention, and the distance between a late-night exchange at a party and an actual initiative with actual resources and actual impact was considerable. Marcus had been around long enough to know that enthusiasm generated in the particular atmosphere of an evening like that one did not always survive contact with the ordinary requirements of the following week. He held the possibility of what Richard had described with genuine hope, but without the kind of desperate attachment that would make him fragile if it did not materialize. What he felt most clearly as the car moved through the night was something that had nothing to do with Richard Hargrove or foundations or initiatives, or any of the external things the evening had produced. What he felt was a clean and uncomplicated sense of his own wholeness. He had walked into a room where people had looked at him and seen someone who did not belong, and he had not argued with them or tried to reposition himself or performed a version of himself designed to change their minds. He had simply done what he knew how to do, with his full attention and without apology, and everything else had followed from that. That was not a lesson he had learned that evening. It was something he had known for a long time and had simply been reminded of in a context that made the reminder feel particularly clear. 3 weeks later, Richard Hargrove's office contacted Marcus by email. The message was professional and specific and referenced the conversation from the party directly, which told Marcus that Richard had not forgotten and had not been speaking casually. It outlined a proposed meeting to discuss the structure of an initiative in more concrete terms, and attached a preliminary document that showed serious thought had gone into the framework since their conversation. Marcus read the email twice at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before school, with his coffee going cold beside him. And then he sat with it for a few minutes before writing a reply that said he was interested and available and looking forward to the conversation. The meeting happened the following month in a conference room in the city, a neutral space rather than the estate, which Marcus took as a sign that Richard intended this to be a working relationship rather than a patron and recipient arrangement. There were 2 other people in the room besides Richard, a program director and a financial administrator, and the conversation was substantive and specific and lasted 3 hours. Marcus came prepared, because preparation was something he took seriously, and he brought documentation about the state of the music program at his school and the schools around it, the numbers that told the story of what was missing and what the missing things actually cost in terms of student outcomes. By the end of that meeting, the shape of something real had emerged. It was not everything that needed doing, because everything that needed doing was larger than any single initiative could address. But it was a genuine start, designed around the specific gaps that teachers and students experienced rather than around the gaps that were most legible from a distance. Marcus was offered a role that gave him meaningful input and meaningful accountability, which was exactly what he had asked for, and he accepted it with the same directness he had brought to every part of the conversation. He did not leave his teaching job. That was something he had thought about carefully and decided about firmly, because the work he did in his classroom was not a placeholder for something better. It was itself the thing, the direct and daily work of sitting with young people, and helping them find what music could give them, and no foundation role, however well constructed, could replace the specific value of that. He negotiated an arrangement that allowed him to contribute to the initiative in ways that did not require him to abandon the classroom, and Richard, to his credit, understood why that mattered and did not push against it. The first grants went out 8 months after that initial meeting, directed to 12 schools across the region, covering instrument repair and replacement, professional development for music teachers, and a small residency program that brought working musicians into schools for extended periods. Marcus was involved in the selection process and in the design of the evaluation framework, and he insisted that the teachers in the receiving schools be treated as experts in their own programs, rather than as recipients who needed to be guided toward the correct use of resources. This was not a small distinction. It shaped everything about how the initiative operated and how the people inside it related to each other. There was a small event held at one of the recipient schools several months into the program, an informal gathering of teachers and administrators and a few of the students whose programs had been affected. Richard attended, which Marcus had not been entirely sure he would, and he moved through the room with a quietness that Marcus had not expected from someone of his prominence. He watched a group of middle school students run through a piece they had been rehearsing, and his attention was complete and unperformed, the kind of attention that cannot be faked. Marcus stood at the back of the room during the student performance and watched the faces of the kids at their instruments. One of them, a boy of about 13 with a serious expression and very careful hands, was playing a passage that required more control than most students his age possessed, and he was playing it well, with a focus that came from somewhere genuine. Marcus watched him and thought about Priya, and about all the students who had come through his classroom, and about the long accumulation of ordinary days that had brought him to this particular moment in this particular room. He did not feel that the evening at the Hargrove estate had changed his life in the way that such stories are sometimes told, as a sudden reversal, a before and after with a clean line between them. What it had done was open a door that allowed something already present in him to find a larger expression, and that was a different thing, more honest and more durable. He walked to his car afterward in the early evening light and sat for a moment before starting the engine. The Honda still made its sound when he turned left. His 2 suits were still hanging in the closet at home. He was still the same man who had stood in his bathroom 3 weeks before a party trying to get a bow tie right. But something had shifted in the landscape around him, and the shift had come not from luck or timing or the intervention of a powerful person, but from the simple and complete act of sitting down at a piano and playing honestly when the moment asked for it. That was something no room could give a person and no room could take away, and Marcus Webb drove home through the evening knowing it belonged entirely to him.